Just imagine a world map without Russia. Well, Ukrainians have done it many times before. Yes, unfortunately this horrible creation does exist next to us, but its name isn't Russia at all. Muscovites stole it too, just as they steal someone else's history, culture and even toilet bowls. It would be more fair to call this country Muscovy, and today's video will try to convince you of this. We'll start with the fact that Rus was only Kievan and no other, and when universities were already functioning in Kiev, frogs were still croaking in Muscovia and people lived on islands among the swamps in dugots. Their language was the Muscovite swearing and a bunch of different dialects. If you would like to see a video about this, please leave a comment. But we'll begin with the 15th century with the story of Ivan III and his wife Sophia, a Greek princess. Sophia was shocked when she saw the conditions in which Ivan lived, that it was a dirty place, and by the way, Moscow means dirty water in the language of the indigenous people of Finnish origin, a land without history or culture, which meant that it was out of the question to call it a decent state. So Sophia began to initiate Ivan, started to think about the idea, what if we assigned the history of Byzantium to Muscovia? It's really powerful, it has a huge historical extent, it has reputation, not just some frogs croaking in swamps. What was needed to do this? To conquer Kiev and appropriate its history, because after the fall of Byzantium, Kiev became its greatest heir, the greatest Orthodox state. The coat of arms was stolen from the same Byzantium, and moreover Moscow calls itself the Third Rome. What else is this but identifying itself with someone else's history? Furthermore, in addition to the occupation of Kiev, they also dream of occupying Constantinople, now Istanbul, describing this territory as their own, which again is not the case. This premise is extremely important for understanding that Muscovia has never had anything of its own, except for the swamps, of course. Even vodka is Polish, and the bust shoes that Muscovites are so proud of are actually Finnish, although this can be partially added to their heritage because Finnish tribes were the basis of the so-called Great Russians. We should also mention Ivan IV of Ivan the Terrible, who managed to include many ranks in his title. He was the Tsar of all Russia, at the same time the Grand Duke of Moscow, Vladimir, Novgorod, Pskov, Tver and Bulgaria. We could go on and on with this list, but we won't. The thing is that Ivan the Terrible could not even be a Duke and Tsar of Russia because at that time Moscovia controlled only a part of the Chernihiv Principality. In other words, Ivan the Terrible, in the long tradition of Muscovites, was simply lying. So, how did the story of the huge theft that still has consequences today begin? To find out, we need to go back to 1721, namely to October 22nd, 1721. On this day, Peter the Great renamed the Moscow Tsardom to the All-Russian Empire. He also proclaimed himself emperor. As a reminder, for most of its very short history, Muscovia was a vassal of the Golden Horde. You would agree that this is clearly not something to be proud of on a national scale, and Peter the Great carried out a kind of rebranding as if to reset everything that happened in the days of Muscovia, the Moscow Tsardom. More than that, according to Muscovites, the new name gives them the right to claim the lands, history and culture of Kievan Rus. This is exactly what the Muscovites lacked so much. But the question is, who pushed Peter the Great to such a bold theft? The name of this person is Feofan Prokopovich. In 1721, he promoted Tsar Peter the Great of Moscow to introduce the new manipulated name for the Moscow Tsardom, stealing the Greco-Byzantine name Rus, Russia, from which the so-called All-Russian Empire emerged. By going so, he betrayed his country, its history and previous generations, and in fact created what Ukrainians have suffered and are still suffering from. Looting is also an old illness of Muscovites. Nowadays, we can recall, for example, the removal of an entire museum from Kherson and other cities of Ukraine. At the very same time, Muscovy was looting Kiev, Chernihiv, Kalish, Pereyaslav. These were the main cities of Kievan Rus, and they were simply plundered. This means that the evidence that Rus is not Russia was stolen, so to speak. Muscovites haven't changed over hundreds of years. They are pathetic looters with Ukrainian washing machines on their backs. But it wasn't enough to rob. They had to rewrite history. Oh, the Muscovites are also virtuosos in this. The well-known Catherine the Great also took up this process. In 1783, she created a commission to compile notes on ancient history, mainly Russian, despite the fact that Russian history practically didn't exist. What a paradox. They wrote a new history of Moscow. In fact, this is a complete lie and manipulation, but this is where the very myth about the 1,000-year history of Moscow came from. The Trion nation, which Ukrainians have been brainwashed with for so long, saying that Ukrainians, Belarusians and Muscovites have a common origin and are separated solely because of the evil will of the Tatars and much more. Immediately, we thought of the monument to Prince Volodymyr, or rather Vladimir, in the center of Moscow. We believe that Prince Volodymyr wouldn't have been happy about this development and the distortion of his name, to put it mild. Of course, the looting and appropriation didn't end there. In 1843, the Muscovites formed another commission for robbing Ukraine and, of course, for manipulating history, namely the Kiev Archaeological Commission. As a result, Muscovite museums are packed with stolen Ukrainian history. These incredibly important exhibits need to be returned to Ukraine. Specifically, this is why Muscovy must disintegrate and no longer exist, because what is built on lies cannot live forever. During the Soviet Union, the trend continued. The Muscovites were not interested in true history. They were more invested in functional history. After all, the swamp system and dirty dugouts still resonated in their not so healthy minds. Let's go back to one of our videos and remind you that the Muscovite language didn't exist for a long time, and when it did, it became a hodgepodge of Bulgarian and Turkic languages. That's why Muscovites don't understand Ukrainian, Polish, Czech and other languages. They don't even understand Belarusian, which is very similar to Ukrainian. Yet it would seem that Muscovites have no one closer than Belarusians. Besides, there is no Russian language as such, there is a Muscovite language, and the Russian or Ruthenian language is the Ukrainian language. For example, in Polish restaurant menus, you can find a dish called pierogi ruskie. What do you think is this? Of course, these are Ukrainian vareniki. We should also talk about religion, because it has huge impact on society and worldview. So there was only one religious institution, the Kievan metropolis, but there is one giant but. The Muscovites merely again annexed the Kievan metropolis by cunning, trickery and violence. It's just like annexing Crimea. You can take it away, but it doesn't make it yours. And this is yet another proof that Muscovy has nothing to do with Kievan Rus. Another vivid confirmation that Muscovy is not Russia is the coins from a few years before the Moscow Tsardom became the All-Russian Empire. The inscription is clearly visible on those coins, and we haven't even begun to talk about maps, of which there are many. These maps depict the Moscow state, not any other Russia. One more proof we no longer know how many in total that Muscovy is not Rus is that Muscovy is located in territories that have never been called Rus, and people who called themselves Rusins didn't live there. The Muscovites themselves separated themselves from Rusins. For example, in the 15th century, Afanassy Nikitin wrote in his book A Journey Beyond the Three Seas as follows: in one vessel envoy Essenberg and Bukharans and Russian 10 ass hats, and in other vessels 6 Muscovite and 6 Tverit, and cows and our fodder. No need to comment here, we believe. Here's another well-known myth that Muscovites like to use. We are Slavs, they say. No, they are not. Muscovy was an outskirts of Rus, and there were almost no Slavs there. There were mostly Finno-Ugric people living there, such as the Chatmerians, Muroma, and others. Once more, these peoples have nothing in common with Rus. Yes, these people were ruled by Rus princes, but those princes had no right to rule in Kiev or near it. That's why they were looking for happiness, as it were, in the lands of Zalesia, meaning the swamps. Now these Finno-Ugric peoples are being destroyed by modern Muscovites and assimilated. They are forced to forget their history and culture, forced to become pseudo-Slavs. Sadly, the rewriting of history then has very negative consequences today. Putin is openly lying when he talks about the 1,000-year history of Moscow. He wishes for Muscovy to capture Kiev so that he can say that he is the owner of Kiev and therefore the owner of Rus. Muscovites say that they are the titular nation, but then the question arises, where is the Moscow Republic in this case? Moreover, Muscovites again pay tribute, as they did before, but now to the Kadrovites. Muscovy is Muscovy, which still follows the rules of the Golden Horde because it doesn't know any better. No matter how much they want to appear civilized, they still show their true Haidos face over and over again. History has always repeated itself and will continue to repeat itself until Muscovy ceases to exist as an entity, as a prison of nations. Ukraine in turn has to win the last battle with this horde because the future of not only Ukraine depends on it. Subscribe to our channel, put a thumbs and share this video. If possible, please support our project financially.